After learning about all of the pieces in the last video, we're ready to learn about the pawns. As we mentioned last time, each player begins the game with 8 pawns, all in the second rank for white, which I'm highlighting now, and all in the 7th rank for black, which I am highlighting now. Now is a good time to introduce the concept of material. When I say material, it's a way to count who has more pieces of value on the board. In many circumstances, that'll mean that you have a quote-unquote better position on the board, meaning one player isn't necessarily winning, but it is a better position to win, since there is no winning until a result is final, as the results can be a win, a lose, or a draw. For this reason, we use material to often guide us to whether it's good to make an exchange for another piece or not. We don't want to trade a piece worth 3 points for a piece worth 1 point. And pawns, which are worth 1 point material, are worth the least of any piece. So pawns are unique because of how they move and how they capture are different from every other piece. A pawn can only move forward on the board. They can only move 1 square at a time, and unless it's the first time that pawn is moved, then they have the option to move 2 squares, but a pawn can never move forward through another piece. For example, the first move in many games will be for white to move one of their central pawns towards the center 2 squares forward, such as the E pawn, like this, or the D pawn, like this. Despite only being able to move forward, pawns can only capture diagonally. So if I were to move this pawn to E4, and my opponent were to respond by moving a pawn to D5, which I'm demonstrating here, I can capture that, like that. When a piece captures another piece, it takes the square that the previous piece was on, but if we go back, if white were to play pawn to E4, and black were to play pawn to E5, white cannot move through this piece, the pawn that is on E5, and it cannot capture it. And when using chess.com, one way to tell if you're making a legal move is to attempt to make the move, and if the move works, then it's legal. And if the site does not allow you to make the move, it is illegal. So as we say, we try to go forward, we try to go sideways, none of those things are working. There is an advanced way of capturing pawns called en passant, but that is for a more advanced video. Pawns are also unique because if they reach the end of the board, so for white, if this pawn were to reach this square, obviously there's a piece on it now, but should that not be there, and for black, if this pawn here were to reach this square here, E1, again, there's a king there, but should it not be there, they can do what's called the promotion. Now, promotion allows them to become any other piece. So that pawn, in most circumstances, would be made into a queen. And the king is the only piece that it cannot become. You can only have one of those, and if you lose it, the game is over. But we'll talk more about the queen in a later video, but I should mention here that the pawn becomes the queen in most circumstances because the queen is the most powerful piece. So pawns on their own are not very strong. But when you use them together, let's go back here, but when you use them together, they become much more powerful and can easily win you games, believe it or not. One way they can work together is becoming what we call connected pawns, which I'll show here. So if white plays the move G4, pawn to G4, and black plays the move pawn to B5, white goes on pawn to G4, G5, black pawn to B4, white plays pawn to F4, and black plays pawn to C5 here. These pawns for each colored player are considered connected. So the B4 pawn for black is protected by the C5 pawn, and for white, the G5 pawn is protected by the F4 pawn. So what that means is these pawns become much stronger because pawns may only be worth 1 point material, but a piece of greater material wouldn't want to capture it because that piece would be taken back. So for example, a bishop or a knight, which are worth more, and again, we'll cover that in more detail in a coming video, will have a hard time breaking up a pawn chain. So the way to break up a pawn chain is generally with more pawns, but that can get very complicated. So this wraps up the basics of pawns. In the next video, we'll dive into the bishops.